Well, thank you, Amy. As Sheri was saying before, this is one of the great documentaries about art and an artist, and it feels so intimate and spontaneous. And it took what 15 years, 14 years to
14,
make.
14 years of interviewing Louise.
And how hard was it to convince and to come to the conceptually to this film, which is so related to the interaction between her and physically her work?
So the film had a long saga. I was a journalist, and I had interviewed Louise, and I was writing about Louise, and you can see she's a Boonwell character. And I thought there has to be a film about her, and I asked if I could do it. I was doing on-air commentary on the PBS McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. She wanted to be on that because although she says she isn't an actress, she is an actress. And and she said yes, and I didn't know how to make a film. And so the program of art on film at the Metropolitan Museum put me together with Marion Cajori. Marion Cajori was a wonderful maker of films on art. She had made a film about Joan Mitchell, which is still being shown, and she, while we were making this, made a film about Chuck Close. And we just started filming. The very first interview we did was an interview as she was going to make work for Venice, where she was going to be showing at the Venice Biennale. And so the film, it's a long answer to your question, but the film evolved. I mean, Marion was an incredible filmmaker. Her eye for the art and how to film the art and how to light the art was my lesson in filmmaking. It's extraordinary the way she really could totally get into the art. And when we started filming, we did film the whole thing in 35 millimeter. And when we started filming, Louise would, Marion would cut a scene, and you know how that worked. It was a guillotine, and you got a film strip, and you put it up with a clothespin. And by the end, we were visiting Louise in her house with a high-8 camera because she was not leaving her house, and Marion would film her with a high-8. And by then, we had the first digital editing. But Marion died in 2006, and we had not edited the film, and the media was strewn all over. And once we got to connect the media and actually be able to see it, there was so much of Louise. There was so very, very much of Louise that it did seem as if the only way to make a film like this was impressionistically, in relationship, her body, herself, her art. It's something that really works with very intense art. I mean, I think of Joan Didion. I think of the Year of Magical Thinking.
Joan
Didion. Yeah, thank you, Joan Didion. It is the only way I can think of to capture this kind of intensity.
And you said 35 millimeter. They're very big. They were very big cameras, and this is really close. You know, the filming is so, as I said before, intimate. How complicated logistically was that, and also together to be so spontaneous with this, gigantic machines.
Well, it really wasn't spontaneous when you really think about it. I mean, in those early scenes especially, Louise performed for us. She had set up the scene. She was going to do what she was going to do, and she performed. And so we were filming a production, really. And we lost some because the filming didn't work. We lost another one because she had hysterical fit about what we were doing. So they weren't that spontaneous. And then it became much more spontaneous when it was the high-8 just sitting across from her. And that was really the emotional, intense filming.
Question. Do you think that artists ever get over their childhood? No, that's not a real question. It's a remarkable
feature
Eric. Of this film, though.
Hey, April.
I think there are many artists
in
this room. I think it's actually the human condition that, and I jest, but I do think it's a remarkably touching component of the film, and I think one of the surprising elements for the viewer because the work is so resonant with major trends in 20th century art and sculpture, as we see in the context even of the show at the church. And at the same time, to learn this revelation that it's so deeply personal and evolves from an iconography that's developed as biography. Given all of that, was there anything that she made off limits to you guys because that intimacy is so remarkable?
Yeah, she lied to us and we believed her.
About what?
She said she had never been psychoanalyzed. She knew, she'd read Melanie Klein. She knew it all, but she said no. Oh, I would never do that. Well, and we believed her, but it turned out that not only had she been psychoanalyzed for years and years and years, but after her death, they published her psychoanalytical diaries. And I think at the church, by the way, if you haven't seen the exhibit at the church, it's extraordinary. But I think at the church, one of the programs is going to be a psychiatrist who runs the Bourgeois Foundation.
Well, actually, it's Philip Larrett Smith, who is a curator, and Jameson Webster, who's a psychologist and a psychoanalyst, and they will be talking about psychoanalytics, breaking down the imagery of Louise's work, and they may touch on other artists as well. So I think that for any of you interested in a deep dive in the psychoanalytics of all artists, it will be a great program, and that's on July 13th. But you mentioned that you touched just briefly upon the fact of the posthumous, the things that came out posthumously. Prior to getting to that, I'm curious, what did she think of the film?
She didn't see it. Thank God. I mean, I have lived with art. I have worked with artists. It's tough because an artist has to be in control and a filmmaker has to be in control. So Jerry would show her the parts of the film that he thought she should see. So she never actually saw
the final cut,
the whole film. She never saw the whole film. Actually, Jerry was one of the most extraordinary people to work with. I mean, he just made everything available. He helped in every way he could. And there was only one thing he didn't like and he wanted us to take out. And that was when he talks about how she fell down when he first met her and he thought, oh, this bitch. And he wanted to take that out. And I said, you know, Jerry, it's so obvious, the love between you. And that's an important part of it. And he let it stay.
Yeah, but no, but also the way he tells the scene, you know, and that he left her and she immediately, you know, it's like the connection. He's a very important character. What did he decide? What do you think he decided that she should see and what she kept from her? Do you have any idea?
I don't know. I don't know what Louise would have thought was acceptable and I'm sure she thought the performances she did for us in the beginning were acceptable. And she was so open about her feelings that I don't know if she thought those would have been. You know, sometimes, as you know, what people don't like is how they look or, you know, how they come across, something that you wouldn't expect. And so I have no idea what it was he thought. Louise, she had an access to her unconscious that infants have and mad people have. And to be that open to your unconscious all the time must be unbearable. It just seems to me. And I think that making the art, finding a form for these internal emotions was really the only way she could function.
And yes.
Oh, no, go ahead. But
well, I was curious, it doesn't feed off of that directly, but one of the remarkable ways in which that manifests are in the rooms and the cells, which we seldom see these days in exhibition format because they are quite cumbersome and not all of them have survived past her lifetime. I was wondering where all of those rooms and cells were that you were shooting in. Were those erected specifically? Because not all of them were in Venice, right?
So a lot of them were in Venice, and one of my, once again, first filmmaking experiences, because we filmed her in Brooklyn and then we went to Venice. We were locked into the American Pavilion all night, and we were lighting and shooting, I think 5 or 6 cells. And then when it came to Brooklyn, there were many more cells. So basically, it was Venice and Brooklyn. But then the cell where you see Jean Louis, that was at the Prada Foundation in Milan. And I have to say, this is one of the, the kill the darlings moment in filmmaking. So that story Jean Louis tells about the lamb and throwing it out the window, he told that exact same story in the exact same words at a party at Muccia Prada's in Milan, and we filmed him saying it, and then the shoes and the clothes and we tried to interweave them, and it took you away, because she says her work is cathartic, and I think, like in a Greek tragedy, it's cathartic for the audience as well, and we needed to keep the audience close in on it.
There is a word that's used a lot today, and it's immersive. And I think what's remarkable about the film is also the way you film art, because you film her art, and it's interesting because it's unusual for a documentary that started in the in the early 90s and evolved into 2007, but to film art like this, where you're almost like inside the art and with the art, is very unusual. Can you talk a little bit about the way that those decisions and that conception?
So as I say, that is Marion. I mean, that was Marion's conception, and that is how she saw filming art. When she made the film about Chuck Close, she actually found a camera she could put on his finger, so that you really are close up to everything he is doing. So it was her idea that you have to be in the art. And then when we cut the film, we felt you also had to be in the film. I know, Sheri, you asked about the interviews we did. We interviewed some pretty important people like Germano Chalant and some people like that. And Rob Storr is a very intellectual person. But we made the decision, you have to be in this. You have to stay in it. And the only interviews in this film are interviews where people have an emotional connection to Louise.
Yeah, I think that comes across really clearly. And for me, that is the reason why I consider it one of the best art documentaries. For me, it's on par with Penny Baker's take on Bob Dylan, because you have this incredible closeness that it's not only about the depiction of Louise on the screen, as well, and that closeness with the camera, and as well, to Giulia's point, as that is further enforced by the way the art is shot, and that's further enforced by, which comes through very clearly, the point you just made, that the people who speak to her are sharing intimacies. And so the overall effect is that you are inside this world that's a very self-contained space for Louise Bourgeois. And I feel that for me as a viewer, and I wouldn't be surprised if everybody feels this way, you felt like this closeness to her by watching the film. And yet you're so far removed from the subject now at this point by years and decades as well. How aware of that were you, of compiling that whole sensibility while you were creating the film? And do you think that sensibility is a reflection of a component of her work?
You wouldn't do it with anybody else. I mean, you might be that close. I actually, if I were to make the film now, I wouldn't show every work of art. I might take out some of that incredible filming, but I don't think you could do that with anyone else, because there is no one else who is that intimately open. Can you imagine anybody else being that open? And that open in the work as well, that revelatory in the work. So I think that's totally Louise.
Shall we maybe also open it?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay, there is one right here.
So I wrote I wrote a paper. I'm very old, so I'm 60 years old. I wrote a paper in college on Louise Bourgeois. I have been a longtime lover of her. Glad to be here. In her older age, she did sculptures out of
Her old clothes.
yeah, like she had arthritis. She was amazing. Why was that not brought up in the film? I mean, I love this film, and I love you guys, and I love her. Just as a lifelong passionate person.
I'm sorry. All those clothes are in the film.
Louise Bourgeois wasn't dead yet when the film was finished.
Okay.
So it was all of what you're
So
referring
I'm
to
sorry,
hadn't
went to go get
happened yet.
popcorn. I'm gonna.
But I do want to say something about that. So she talks about having the seamstress there, and she had a seamstress. And one of the images is we come close on is a tapestry face, and you come close on it, you can see it's all badly sewn. And I said to Frances Morris, could she sew like that? And Frances said, no, it's what she could do was what's on that face, but she had a seamstress who could do it. Same with the spiders. I mean, she could make the drawings, she could have the idea, but then there would be workmen that would help finesse it.
You might also be referring to, there was a body of work that wasn't really it started just around the time that this film was probably wrapping, which are the late tapestry collages. Is that what you're referring to? And so in the very end, like in the last 10 years of her life, she was making these tapestry collages. They're more or less two-dimensional, like they're framed works. Many of them were of spider webs. But those are not included in the film, and I believe because they hadn't really been started. She started making them around 2005.
There is a question right there. Yeah.
Thank you for the film. Did you ever film the salons that she did in her house?
I'm glad you brought up the salons. So, the one thing about Louise is she was terrified of powerful men. The first time I really interviewed her, she was freaking out because Michael Kimmelman, who was at that point the art critic for the New York Times, had been to see her the day before. And she said, I was up all night. Why did I say that? Why didn't I say that? She was still, trembling from that. But women, not so much. So we were able to, make this film. But, and therefore she was pretty nice to women because she trusted us and expected women to be nice to her, except at the salons. So how many people in this room were at one of Louise's salons? Yeah. Wow. Did you cry?
No, she was actually pretty nice.
You're a man. So these salons is any artist could look up her phone number and her address in the phone book and come to her Sunday salons. And, it would be better if you brought chocolate and brandy. She loved chocolate and her guests loved brandy. And then the artist would come up and show their work and she would talk about it. She was very, very admiring of portraitists. She thought portrait painting was a very important, difficult thing. But if she didn't think you were coming from a real place or she had some other reason to reject you, she'd make you cry. And I saw that on a number of occasions.
There's just one right there. Yep. You get in the mic.
Thank you so much. This was amazing for me. I've been a fan of her work for so long, and when I was at SVA, nobody really knew about her, and she's just kind of this ethereal thing that was, and her work is so fresh. So I just wanted to let you know that my reaction to her work was so represented in your film, and really is touching to see, and it's still so fresh and wonderful. Was there a lot of dating and romance and having to go on to convince her to do this? Like, what was the setup with her to, was it just, a couple of conversations and she said, yes, let's do it? Or
the first time I mentioned it, she said, yeah.
It was just that quick.
But Marion had been trying to get to her, and Marion had been filming the work, and Marion could not get to her. So it worked perfectly because Marion wanted to, and I could, but didn't know how to make a film.
Hi. I wonder who chose this music. I think it was so appropriate for the parts. It's just, I could almost close my eyes also and see it. Now, who did the choice of the music? Amy.
So my husband, Bill Edwards, is here, and he is a classical music aficionado. And yeah, Bill. And I asked him, is there a piece of music in a minor key that is a child's nursery rhyme? And he came up with Mahler's First Symphony. And so a lot of it is quotes from Mahler's First Symphony. And then Ken Coblin, the wonderful editor, is very good at mashing, and he mashed. And then we ended with Laurie Anderson. So it's the entire, like Louise, the entire 20th century. But I agree. I think that Ken did a wonderful job.
Really
with the
add
music.
up so much, and thank you.
Right there.
Thank you so much. Obviously, I think we've all seen her work all over the world, and it's really interesting to kind of take a much more personal view of her. I was actually had the pleasure of going into her apartment after she died, but there were tours, and it looked as if she had just died overnight and nobody touched anything. I'm not sure if it looked, I mean, I could recognize pieces in this film. But what I was going to ask is, wow, what was her relationship like with her kids? That was, I mean, I'm surprised any of them showed up, and I mean, they must be permanently damaged.
Yeah. I mean, you saw Jean-Louis, and then she had another. Alain was he became a judge, and then he gave that up and was a lawyer. He had a family and children, and stayed very clear of her. But then I think in the end, there was more of a rapproche. I think she was probably not a very good mother. She was also, I want to bring this up. Her husband was Robert Goldwater. Robert Goldwater wrote the book Primitivism and Modern Art, as a result of which Nelson Rockefeller made him the first director of the Museum of Primitive Art, and the Michael Rockefeller Wing is now that museum at the Metropolitan. It's wonderful. Go see it.
Yeah, they just reopened, actually.
It just reopened, and it's totally fabulous. But Louise, for many years, she was the French wife of this great, thinker, and she dressed, the part, and she had these dinner parties, was apparently not a good cook, but she had these dinner parties. And Robert Goldwater died in bed in 1973. And after that, she just didn't do any of that. She didn't keep up the house. She didn't do housework. She didn't cook. Well, she cooked for herself. But she just became who she wanted to be.
I think that what's in the film, in spite of all the things that people are, of course, curious about, were exactly right, because I felt watching this film that I'd seen more of what really an artist internally is made of than anything I've ever seen. I think it's a tremendous success. It's daring and it's disturbing, but in the best possible way. And I really thank you for keeping it to what it is, what it actually is. I would hate to have more detail, and I think that there is tremendous power in this, and it's in a way not for the faint of heart, because if you're taking it all in psychologically, it's incredibly dark, but in a way that is like the way that Bachelard talks about poetry in order to explain what he is poetic in order to explain what poetry does and is in its actual force. So I think that there's a tremendous force in this movie, and I just wanted to congratulate you and thank you for it. It really blew my mind.
Thank you. But I think it's Louise. Once again, I think you could not make this film about any other artist.
I mean, if you'd had details about her parties and her dresses and I don't know, whatever, but you've kept it to the raw, to a kind of what it seemed like a raw essence. So that.
Can I ask one question? Final question. How did the process of making this film influence the work that you have made since?
It made me a filmmaker. I mean, before that, I was an art critic and a journalist, and I got bitten by the bug. I came to understand that you can do things in film that I can't do with written word. For instance, and that's really what I wanted to do.
And you've made now two films since?
Two more films, yeah.
And that was Kabakov and...
So they became so first of all, the artists were different. The Kabakov film, I had met him in the Soviet Union when it was falling apart. Then he came to the West, became the great Soviet artist, Soviet-born artist in the West, though he'd not been allowed to show there, never wanted to go back to Russia. And in 2008, Dasha Zhukova, who was married to Abramovich, invited him to open the garage, and he was in 7 venues around Moscow, including the Pushkin Museum, and it was a historic event. And I made that film, and I made that within a historical context of him remembering his Stalinist childhood, and that made me understand how much I also enjoy telling a story, and also relating the art to the events around it, putting it in context. So it's changed. Does that mean I wouldn't do another film that went deep into a portrait of an artist? I would if I found the artist.
Well, I mentioned the Kabakov film because I actually see a lot of symmetry, a lot of influence of this film on that film. They do feel like two works that are made by the same artist, in my opinion.
Because of the deep emotion. The difference is
and also even the approach to the works, where you are able to make a direct relationship between the artist and the work without having to bring in a talking head to explain that to you. And that's consistent in both films.
Do you have an artist that you're thinking of, or?
There are 2 artists I'd like to make a film about. I don't know one of them. I haven't even asked really, and the other. No, I haven't asked either of them. So one of them, I'd love to make a film about Yoko Ono, who I think is not recognized as an artist and is another really incredibly deep artist. And I'd love to make a film about Sheri Nishat, who has a show right now at the Parish, by the way.
Wow. Do we have one more question?
And I'd love to kind of work on a feature film.
You mean like fiction?
Well, no, but based on a real artist in a real situation.
But it would be a dramatic.
Like a Pollock kind of thing.
Well, yeah.
Not that one.
Not that one. Okay. Yeah.
So it was mentioned earlier in the film that Louise was an artist first before a feminist, and I was just curious about her relationship and response to the Guerrilla Girls and just being such an impactful, like, inspirational figure in the feminist movement and how she felt about all of that.
Well, there was a very famous dinner at which she was feted, and I can't remember the details now. Somebody in the audience might. Who threw it? Lucy Lepard? I can't remember. But anyhow, she really did not want to have anything to do with the feminist movement because she did not want to be drawn into what she considered a ghetto. At that point it was. She wanted to be a great artist, which is in fact how she is regarded.
Okay, very last one. Yeah.
Do you think she had a crush on Rob
Storr? Oh, okay. So so Rob Storr calls her his French mistress. I mean, he's being funny. I mean, he's like 40 years younger than she is and everything like that. But they had a very intense emotional connection. So, and she also had a crush, I think, on Alfred Barr, and I think she hoped at one point, Gorovoy has said maybe that something would develop between them, but he's gay. So I think she did have affairs after Robert Goldwater died, but I don't think with any of those men.
Well, okay, last.
Thanks. One quick question. What do you think about all the late recognition of artists like her and like Helmuth Klint and particularly female artists that are being discovered? Do you think that's something that is that she helped pioneer in some ways? Being recognized in her 70s and 80s, or what's your thought on that? I'm also curious one other thing about her training as an artist when she was younger. Do you know anything about that? I was curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, she studied the Académie Julienne in Paris, which was actually Rauschenberg went to Académie Julienne for a little while as well. So she had a real training in art, and also all these Frank Cusi and all these people were there for her to learn at their feet. So she had a real training in art. Was she? Somebody else in the audience might be able to better explain about whether she helped women artists get recognized, because she was recognized so late. I mean, I think she is a great artist and has been recognized as a great artist. Did that help other women artists?
I mean, I think
know.
all of the women of her generation and all of the women after World War II helped create an environment for art where things are such as they are today, where there's, you know, much more of an embrace and inclusion in exhibitions and in the marketplace. So I think Louise was certainly a figure in that, but I would include Agnes Martin in that generation as well. I think
Lee
is tremendously
Krasner.
important. Lee Krasner. Although what's interesting is somebody like Lee Krasner and Agnes Martin and Louise Bourgeois received the acclaim very late in their careers, and in fact, you might even argue posthumously, whereas that opened the door for artists, female artists who have enjoyed their own success in their lifetime. People like Cindy Sherman, for example, in one generation, and Cecily Brown. I mean, there are now female artists who have every kind of opportunity that 100 years ago they would not have.
Can I just say, did everybody spot Cindy Sherman marching?
I did. I was
She
shocked.
was marching with the Guerrilla Girls.
I tapped my wife. That was incredible.
Well, I want to thank Amei and Sheri and the church for the show, and everybody for coming.
Thank you all. And yes, thank you to the church. And thank you. It's wonderful to be here, Giulia. Thank you.
Thank you.